It speaks not only of a place, but a plan.
Plan to be enacted in the event of Morgoth's defeat by his successor.
Welcome back, everyone. It's Charlie. This will be my full Lord of the Rings Rings of Power Episode 3 video. There were a whole bunch of Easter eggs, so we'll break it all down. If you're brand new to the channel, I will be doing videos for all the episodes. Be sure to subscribe to get them. Careful for spoilers from the episode. If you haven't seen it yet, we'll just start at the beginning and work our way through shot by shot, talking about Easter eggs and WTF moments. Starting with the title was Adar. He's the fallen elf character played by Joseph Mawle, who most of you will remember as Benjen from Game of Thrones. The way they're using him on the show, they've explained, is that he's sort of like the mid-boss on the way to Sauron eventually. So he's not meant to be another form of Sauron. He's like a completely separate character they created for the show. He's not somebody from the books. Because of Galadriel's prologue at the beginning of episode 1, talking about how things never are evil in the beginning, I think he was also one of the elf children that were there in the prologue. You see a very fuzzy version of his face teased at the end of the episode. The actual episode felt like it was more about setting up Numenor and setting up the place that will become Mordor in the Southlands here, and confirming the Mark of Sauron is also meant to be a map of what Mordor will eventually become. The whole reason why Sauron decided to make Mordor here, make his realm here, is because of the natural mountain range provided this natural protection, just making it easier for him to defend the area. During the episode, when Arondir looks up around at all the devastation that the orcs have wreaked on the area, that's just foreshadowing the devastation that Sauron's forces will wreak in this area, so that eventually it will look more like this as you see it during the events of the Lord of the Rings movies. A lot of people also been calling this Southlands area Before Dor, because it will eventually turn into Mordor, which I think is kind of funny, Before Dor. The other real big reveal too is what's going on with Halbrand's character, and now I actually kind of think that he might turn out to be the Witch King of Angmar, or it might wind up happening is Theo might turn out to actually be his son, and he might wind up becoming the Witch King later in the timeline. I already explained how Halbrand is connected to the Southlands, like the sigil that he wore around his neck was the same sigil that we saw in the Southlands, and Galadriel also finds the documents in their Hall of Records, the ancient records, that reveal that's the mark of royalty in that area previously, the same kings that swore fealty to Morgoth during the First Age. So they're kind of setting up Halbrand as the reluctant leader, kind of like Aragorn during the events of the Lord of the Rings movies, where at first he doesn't want to have anything to do with it and he's very reticent because he's worried about falling to darkness the same way that his ancestors did, the same way that Aragorn is kind of worried about falling to darkness the same way that Isildur, who we also meet during the episode, his ancestor, fell to the influence of the One Ring. So I think in this episode, they soft confirmed that Halbrand is not going to be a version of Sauron, and also Adar is not meant to be a version of Sauron either. There's a couple of characters that wonder if that's the case because he is an elf, but he's meant to be a fallen elf, completely different character than Sauron, so we probably have not seen Sauron yet. I think the whole idea is they're setting up Adar here to be the boss of Season 1, and then towards the end of Season 1, then maybe they'll reveal what's going on with Sauron. And up to that point, we'll just see his mark all over the place and his influence be felt. But the episode begins with the orcs capturing Arondir and taking him back to their camp, where we find out they're holding everyone captive, forcing the men to work in their tunnels, making them bigger, basically slowly turning the area into what will eventually become Mordor. With all this devastation, you can see their path just extending for miles. All the other elves that he meets in here are the same elves that were working at the tower who have also been captured since then. Then we check back in with Galadriel and Halbrand, who wake up on the Númenórean ship on the way back to Numenor, confirming that it's Elendil's ship. He's Isildur's father, who recognizes her as one of the Eldar. The Eldar is the ancient name that the Valar gave to the elves just in general. So even though there are many groups of elves all over different parts of the world, they're all referred to as Eldar. It'd be like calling all the people on Earth humans of Earth. The reason he uses this term at the beginning is because they want to set up his connection to the elves and the Valar in general. I'll talk about this throughout the episode as they reference some of these things, but there are a lot of references to the faithful and a lot of the things that happen in the books. But obviously you can see they've compressed the timeline because the Isildur that we remember is actually during the War of the Last Alliance, the one who cuts the One Ring off of Sauron's hand. And in the books, that's like thousands of years later, but Númenóreans only live for about 200 years. So there's like this massive time compression during the Second Age, so it's a little bit harder to follow if you're going by book events. So we'll just have to see what stuff they all throw into the pot here that winds up being the actual show. But the other big connection between his family and the elves are through Elrond's character, so Numenor was founded by Elrond's twin brother, Elros. When they sail in here, the giant statue that's looking out over the bay is a statue of Elrond's twin brother, Elros. They were both born half-elven, and they were given the choice to either live life as an elf, and they would gain immortality like the rest of the elves, or they would live life as a human, and they would live normal human lifespan. Elrond chose to live life as an elf, and thus he continues to live for thousands of years. But his brother Elros chose to live life as a human, married an unnamed woman. We don't know who his wife was in the books, and they founded the nation of Numenor. The statue in the prison area here might be of Elros's wife or his mother and Elrond's mother, Elwing. And as they explain, the island of Numenor is kind of like an Atlantis in the world of Tolkien, but the island itself and this longer lifespan was given to them as a gift by the Valar because of their service during the War of Wrath in the First Age. Like the Valar literally rose the island out of the water and then just gave it to him. Say, hey, this land belongs to you now, and we're also doubling your lifespan. So like a normal member of their race might live for about 200 years. Aragorn, for example, is one of the last descendants of Isildur and his father Elendil. That's why he's about 210 years old when he dies, because he has Numenorean blood in his veins. He was also about 87 years old during the events of Return of the King, so obviously it looks very good for his age. During this part of the timeline, in the world of Tolkien, a normal human lifespan like the Southlanders is more like 90 years. When Galadriel refers to Numenor as the Land of the Star, that's because their island was brought up by the sea by Ulmo as a gift to the Edain for their part in the war against Morgoth. It was also called Star Wards because the Edain were led to it by the Star of Arendelle, and because the island was in the shape of a five-pointed star. You actually see the five-pointed star symbol on a lot of their weapons and armor too. When they sail in, it looks fantastic. Love the special effects on this. Obviously, they spend a bunch of time and a bunch of money on this part. But if the architecture looks familiar, that's because most of the major structures, like the castles, the towers in Middle-earth later in the timeline during the events of the Lord of the Rings movies, are all built by the Numenoreans after they came to Middle-earth, or the ones that survived the Doom in Numenor. For example, Gondor, founded by Isildur and his family after they came to Numenor. Obviously, one of the major events in the show they're building towards is the creation of the Rings of Power, but the other major thing is the downfall of Numenor. Sauron was also mostly responsible for the downfall of their race by tricking them into invading Valinor. Like I said though, a lot of the events of that and the creation of the Rings of Power are like two completely different parts of the timeline, but I think that they've compressed that because they're compressing the timeline for the show itself. So we'll see how long it is before they actually forge the Rings of Power, or they start forging the Rings of Power, and how soon we actually see the downfall of Numenor. That might wind up being like the very last season of the show when both of those things happen. Like they might just have those happen in the same season. It sounds like the way that Sauron is going to trick the elves, like the promises he's going to offer them in creation of the rings, will be similar to the promises that he offers to the Numenoreans that will lead them to try and invade Valinor to their great doom. I didn't get too much into this in my episode 1 and episode 2 video, but the whole idea is that Celebrimbor says that he wants to create something that will last, and that's why they need to create the world's greatest forge, basically. The whole idea is that during this period, the elves actually want to find a way to preserve their realms so that they'll be everlasting in the way that their own lives are everlasting, because even though they continue living, like they're functionally immortal, all the life around them, like the cities that they live in, the land that they live on, those things decay like you would normally expect. And the elves want to find a way to make it be a little bit more like it is back on Valinor. So the whole idea is that Sauron is able to trick the elves into creating the Rings of Power because one of the effects of the rings is to preserve life. So that's probably what he's going to tell them, like, look, I found a way, we can preserve everything, but we have to create these special rings. And the whole idea with the downfall of Numenor, because even though they have longer lifespans, they kind of set this up during the episode, this hatred that they have for the elves and for the Valar. When they're talking about the previous king being deposed because he actually liked elves and he was trying to take them back to more pro-Valar stance, what basically happened is that over time, over the centuries, the Numenoreans eventually grew to regret not having the same immortality as elves and started to resent them for that. So Sauron basically lets himself be captured by the Numenoreans and eventually tricks them into worshipping Morgoth, thinking that if they do, they will gain immortality by invading Valinor. There are a couple references to this later in the episode, and a group of Numenoreans that they call the Faithful, like they literally mention the word the Faithful during the episode. I'll explain a little bit more about that in a second when we get to that part of the episode. During the first episode though, when Galadriel almost sails back to Valinor and this big veil seemingly opens up, this very magical looking veil, and you hear this song in the background, it feels like for the show, they've actually kind of moved things around in the timeline, and they've sort of upgraded what they call the ban of the Valar on Valinor. Like, they basically ban everyone from sailing to Valinor. So, like, if you had a ship, during a certain part of the timeline, you could still try to sail there. Now, you'd probably get killed if you came within sight of it, but you could still do it. After the downfall of Numenor, literally Iluvatar basically cracks the earth and changes its shape to round, like the earth used to be flat before the downfall of Numenor, and separates the entire continent of Valinor from the rest of the world, so the only way to reach it is through magic. So even if you did have a ship after the downfall of Numenor, you couldn't just sail to Valinor if you wanted to. Your ship would just get lost in the sea here. Everyone probably recognizes the White Tree, similar to the White Tree of Gondor. The White Tree of Gondor was basically taken from seedlings from this particular White Tree. The whole thing with the white trees is that they're like the same species of tree as the original two trees that were destroyed by Morgoth and the giant spider Ungoliant. The only difference is that they don't give off the same light that the original two trees did, but they are the same type of trees. The really cool ability that these trees have, though, is that the white trees will shed their petals when they sense the evil is afoot. During the trailer, you see the White Tree of Numenor shed its petals. I think that's the whole idea, that Sauron has started walking around the earth and the tree is sensing that evil. Later in the episode, when Elendil is at the Hall of Records with Galadriel and says that it was barely survived from being destroyed by the previous king, one of the things that Sauron tries to do once he eventually twists the Númenóreans towards the side of Morgoth is to cut down the White Tree. The reason why there's a White Tree in Gondor later in the timeline, though, is because Isildur is able to steal some of the fruit from the tree and they use the seeds from that to plant a new White Tree. Also, later in the timeline, after Aragorn formally becomes the king of Gondor and unites the realms of men, he also finds another sapling of the White Tree and plants a new White Tree. During most of the events of the movies, their White Tree has already died. Then we meet Pharazôn and his wife Tar Miriel, the current queen regent. Pharazôn is important because he's the person who basically presides over the Númenóreans trying to invade Valinor. He's like the person responsible directly for the downfall of Numenor, even though Sauron tricked them into doing it. Miriel is the right-born daughter of the previous king. Pharazôn kind of usurps her power when she's forced to marry him. So you get this whole xenophobic vibe going on in Numenor. It just gets worse and worse and worse until they eventually try to invade Valinor. They say Miriel's father is trapped in the tower, sort of like an exile within Numenor, just forced to live out the rest of his days there. His name was Tar Palantir, which will remind you of the Palantirs, which we actually saw in the trailers. Those are the Seeing Stones that you see later during the events of the movies. They were created by Feanor, who also created the Silmarils, which they mentioned in Episode 1 and Episode 2. There's all these scenes with Halbrand having this silver tongue trying to talk his way into staying on Numenor, but it's all, I think, a misdirect because he's kind of this reluctant king-type figure, kind of like Aragorn. Like, he gives Galadriel's dagger back and they become a little bit closer. Previously, he was like #1 on my Sauron watch list. Like, it just seems so deceiving here, but now I think it's actually more likely that he winds up either becoming the Witch King of Angmar or one of the 9 kings of men that become Ringwraiths. One of the advantages that the show has in doing the origin of the Witch King in the Nazgul is that there isn't a whole lot about their backstory that the books get into, so it's sort of like a wide open area. Like in the books, they never reveal who the Witch King of Angmar was before he became the Witch King. Also, he has a flaming sword that looks a lot like the flaming sword that Theo was using in Episode 2. When they mention Elendil's son, we see Isildur for the first time, famous, eventual king of Gondor who cut the One Ring off of Sauron's hand, like I said, after his father was killed, and then fell to the One Ring's influence. The thing you have to remember, and they kind of mention this later in the episode, is that he has a brother named Anarion, and then many generations later, you have Aragorn. One of the major additions that they did on the show, though, is that they gave them a sister. So Isildur has a sister on the show, but not in the books. We'll see if she becomes a big part of the plot. Like, I don't know why they would include her on the show if she wasn't in the books, if she wasn't going to be a big character on the show. Isildur hears a very ethereal woman whispering his name from a distant island. You can let me know in the comments what you think that is a reference to. I couldn't find any direct references, but I think it's all meant to tie in with the idea that Isildur's family, Elendil's family, is part of the Faithful, and that's one of the reasons why they're able to survive the downfall of Numenor. Because like right after this, you hear Miriel talking, literally mentioning the word faithful. The Faithful are basically the people amongst the Númenóreans race that still are loyal to the Valar. The ones who were not tricked by Sauron into worshipping Morgoth. So later in the timeline, they're the ones that leave to colonize Middle-earth and eventually build Gondor and a lot of the other major structures that you see during the events of the War of the Ring. Elendil explains the origins and the meaning of his name. It means elf friend in Quenya, the language of the elves, is because his family, the area that they come from on Numenor, are still faithful to the Valar. Even though the way they explain it in this episode, largely the Númenóreans have become very xenophobic. When they visit the Hall of Records, you see Galadriel make a lot of references to Elrond and Elros. I already explained their backstory, how he basically chose to live a mortal life and founded Numenor, and Elrond chose to live life as an elf. The other funny thing too is that Galadriel is way, way older than Elrond. Elrond and his brother were actually born on Middle-earth many years after the elves sailed to Middle-earth and the wars with Morgoth had started. As I mentioned earlier, they also confirmed that the mark, in addition to a couple other things, is also meant to be a map marker, and they explain how there was this contingency plan that Sauron developed in the case of Morgoth's defeat. When she says the language of the plan is the Black Speech, it's basically the exact same language that's written on the One Ring of Power, the main language they speak in Mordor eventually. Obviously, they're still making Mordor as we speak, slowly terraforming the Southlands. I think the more interesting thing now to theorycraft, though, in the creation of Mordor, what's going to be happening during the end of the Second Age, the War of the Last Alliance, the War of the Ring, is that it actually implies that Halbrand or his son Theo, like if Theo really does wind up being his son, will be unsuccessful. Like Galadriel's trying to give him this motivational speech the same way that Elrond later in the timeline tries to give to Aragorn. But because we know what happens later in the timeline, it kind of seems like Halbrand's story ends in a super big downer moment. You guys can let me know in the comments, do you think that he becomes the Witch King of Angmar or one of the Nazgul, or do you think that it's Theo that winds up becoming the Witch King or one of the Nazgul? I am positive there's going to be a huge twist with that storyline. Later we check back in with the Harfoots. When they say they've heard of beings turned into stars, they might actually be referring to the Silmarils, because one of the Silmarils basically turned into something that they call the Star of Arendil, that becomes this star that the elves eventually worship. A lot of what happens in the episode is setting up the idea that I think Nori will leave to go with this Meteor Man, possibly a wizard character, to go find this place where they're creating Mordor. The whole idea is that the constellation that he created in episode 2 was meant to be like a map marker. He's probably looking for the place where they're creating Mordor in the Southlands. When her mother says the stars reached down and touched her, that's a reference more to Meteor Man literally being like one of these fallen angel characters in the Tolkien lore, like she kind of did physically get touched by a star in a way. Then when Miriel goes to visit her father, the previous king that got deposed in the tower, when she says the moment they feared is here because Galadriel has arrived, the thing they fear is probably the return of Sauron. Like, they're probably worried more about that, and this is kind of a misdirect. Like, she seemed very standoffish with Galadriel. I think that's a misdirect. I think eventually she's going to try and help Galadriel. My big theory right now for Meteor Man is that he's either one of the blue wizards or he's like a brand new wizard that they just created for the show. I don't think that he's going to be Gandalf or like one of the pre-existing major wizards from the Third Age. I don't think they want to break the timeline that much. Then at the end of the episode, they have that cool elves versus orcs fight, a lot of cool chain kata. They also show you that orcs are literally burned by the sun, and that's why they spend so much time burrowing through the earth. That's why they live underground, because they can't walk around during daylight. The warg that they unleash on them is the same type of larger wolves that were featured in the Hobbit movies, and as they almost escape, they reveal the Adar character, the fallen elf, played by Joseph Mawle. Like I said, I think he's just an underling of Sauron's and currently head of their faction right now until Sauron himself surfaces and takes command. Which might not happen till like the very end of the season or season 2. I don't think it'll happen for a little while. Now I am thinking that we won't actually see Sauron himself for a while. But if you spotted any other Easter eggs or references in the episode that I didn't talk about in the video, just write them below in the comments. There's like 1,000 things that they reference from the lore here, so you could watch the episode like 10 times and still find new little details. My episode 4 video will post next week after they release it, and my House of the Dragon episode 4 video will post this Sunday. Disney Plus Day is also this weekend. There's a bunch of Marvel trailers, probably some Star Wars trailers. I'll do videos for all that stuff as well, so be sure to enable alerts for my channel so you don't miss any of that. Everyone click here for my full House of the Dragon episode 4 trailer video, and click here for my Rings of Power episode 1 and episode 2 video. Thank you so much for watching, everyone stay safe, and I'll see you guys in the next one.